In his introduction to his major work of 4 volumes, The Dramatic Universe, J.G. Bennett writes of the audaciousness of even the idea of someone trying to get to all knowledge. He writes, "We cannot doubt that we human beings have our roots in the natural order, but we can and do wonder if our fruits belong to the same world. The question whether there is some affinity between the total man and the total universe, or whether we are but accidental intruders upon the cosmic scene, is one that must concern every individual, for upon the answer hangs the decision as to the values that should rule our lives. A total question demands a total answer, and this could not be given except in terms of the whole of human experience, including all that man has learned in recent millennia about himself and the universe. Such an undertaking is manifestly impossible of accomplishment unless all experience can be brought into a coherent system capable of apprehension by that limited and capricious instrument, the human mind. It is for us now to assume that we might hazard the entrance through a doorway into that domain of all information. All you have to do is open the door and enter. This dramatic event is available to anyone always, in a sense, because the format and formation of the natural order is such that any one growing object, such as a blade of grass or a rose, an artichoke, a banana, a feather on a bird, or the scales on a serpent, all is the listing by nature of the order of her process. The call for this search is given by Descartes easily, as he instruments the notion that we are far better off to pursue a very wide and broad general research into looking for knowledge than the specialization which has become the bane, he says, of the modern science. The same too for Spinoza, who calls for the generalization of the pursuit of information and through the sciences, though he's heavily biased into geometry and mathematics, as is Descartes. We take another view in the sense that the one thing that is left out in all of these studies, the precursor to all studies, the key to open that door, is the accession to time and timing. Time becomes the language. Time becomes the frequency of occurrence in all domains. We hesitate to use the phrase all domains unless we say that all domains are included in the human self, in the body, in its physiology, in its structure, as form and process, and that there's nothing outside of us that cannot be affirmed and connected with that is not inside of us. In other words, all the outside is within us. Both in Descartes and Spinoza, the question of time is not seen as the very single element which is that which will open that door to the understanding of the natural order. The entrance of the notion of being into the domain of time is dealt with by J.G. Bennett. Much of his work is centered on explaining cycles. He calls the frequencies in nature hyparxis. It is that function in nature which is seen as not only repetition, but the power in the repetition of the growing thing to express its own station in the natural order. For station in nature is coupled with beauty. We can be easily transfixed by a beautiful rose, and yet what we are looking for there is the hierarchic structure frozen in form of the very essence of what all of nature is about, the structure of time. We are to pursue our quest to find out about this structure of time, easily to be seen in how vines grow, they spiral, in corn, where we see all the rows of corn, they're all numbered, they're in their natural order, all filing in the pattern of the golden number. All growth proceeds and is established as its detection and expression and format to structure time. Because we are not only part of the natural order, but synchronistically and perfectly a replication of anything else in the natural order that expresses itself in the form of the golden number, that we are it, in a sense, and it is us. And through all of it, all is within us. So now, we have to assume that possibly in a former time that some individual or system of individuals were granted to understand time and timing, and out of that to have been able to fashion not only the library where the information was installed, and also the door, the entrance into that library, but also to fashion the key which would allow us to enter that library. For our purposes, that library will be the Great Pyramid of Cheops on the Giza Plateau in Egypt. And we are now to investigate an object which is defined by a mind as being a key to open the door of this large library, Cheops Pyramid, and find then, if I have spoken rightly, that when we have gone through all the chambers and looked at various stones and such, and come to a great understanding, we would have seen that the instrument for its unfolding was within us before we entered the door. And that is that we are the expression of time. The selection of a single object to stand as the affirmation of a total understanding that could be put in the key to this library is such that, again, after we had used it to enter the building and pursued all the information within it, we would find that not only was all the information in the object we used as the key to enter, but before we even discovered the key, we were the key. In 1978, on October 12th, slightly after noon, I detected a small rectangle in the base of Cheops Pyramid, in the middle of the north side on the base, a few inches from the sloping stones, and with my knife blade moved the stone till it popped out into my hand. The stone was positioned not just haphazardly, but in a very special metrical location on the base of the pyramid. The activity of my study of the object over 30 years has been no less a study of myself, of course, and it is, as Descartes has suggested, the wider study of the sciences that one is able to broaden their understanding and finally possibly to reach the high levels of intuition which emerge from a proper study and a faithful organization of the self as yielding to the truth. It is a small object. In cubic inches, it is 6.11 0.51 cubic inches. That is a unit of measure which is derived from a very special conjunction between two basic cubits, that of the 25-inch cubit and the 20.6-inch cubit. An adjunct cubit, which is just as important, is a cubit of the dimension of 17.47572816 inches. With these three units of measure, we are well on our way to detect the function and values of the individual parts of this small object. This object is that object which has been alluded to over the millennia as the Philosopher's Stone. All the elements, lines, angles, planes, volumes, relationships between any part and any other part of the Philosopher's Stone are such as to lead us into the understanding of the fullness of the fundamental and basic units of time that we will discover are those which are within us. The breath, the heartbeat, the vibrato in the voice, other frequencies and rhythms in the body which can be identified. Then all these rhythms and cycles are, if not balanced within us, they are in harmony. This is a replica of that original stone which I took out of the front of Cheops pyramid. I immediately, as soon as I was able, weighed it on a number of scales and determined that its weight was very close to about 7.77 ounces on a regular scale of average poids weighting. And subsequently figuring out from the angles and the constraints on volume that the object occupied 6.1151 cubic inch of space, and that measuring all of the individual lines, of which there are 12, and more lines which are determinable as the diagonals of spaces, there are ratios and relationships between any two lines, this line and this line, or these four lines together, or these four lines together, or these four lines together. So the option is not closed to us. We can find as many avenues of discovery in this single object as we are disciplined to discover and patient enough to find that it will tell us not only about it, but it will tell us about the one who's reading it. The object becomes then a catalog of some very special numbers that the author of the stone decided were those few units of measure which would guide us into the best understanding of what the building was that this would be the key for. In other words, though it is the key to the building, it is no less a replication of the pyramid in an abstractual and artful form and device of communication between the architects of the Giza Plateau and any individual that will come to this object and study it. My study has been long and very diligent, and I'm very fortunate to have found quite a lot of the information that was intended for me to find. Now, a bold statement there to say that one might, in a sense, become the Philosopher's Stone. And this is no less than the artful projection of the self to the very heart of the rose which holds us in awe. Is the rose there, or are we the rose? This is a fundamental question of metaphysics, about perception, and is dealt largely especially with Spinoza and as pantheism, and Descartes as his idea about what he is and that he thinks. The notion of what we are can be gained by the proper study of those instruments in nature which aid us in our involvement with those instruments to become one with the object. And this is easily done if one has the practice of simply submission. The idea being to get rid of analysis and interpretation and take what we see and lose ourselves in the image. There are allusions in many writings, and some by great authors, to suggest that, for one, man is the measure. Or put in another way, man is the measurer. Man is the one who measures. And this is fine until you ask what is the operation of measure. How does one measure? If man is the measurer, then how does one measure? A very simple demonstration of measure by the self is to say, how many times does your heart beat when your automobile goes down the road at a certain velocity for, let's say, 600 yards? How many times does the heart beat? There's a conjunction of frequency in the body that can be correlated with the distance and the speed of velocity relative to an exterior framework. And it has fallen to me to be able to articulate that kind of thinking that man is the measurer by frequencies that are within him is all well and good, but it does not satisfy the need for the scientist to have tools to work with. The instrument with which to measure is time itself. And time itself is not something you can hold in your hand, but you can hold in your hand an object which is itself a measure of itself. That way it gives me what it is, not what I want it to be. And so it is that I form a pendulum this long, and then I let it go as a pendulum and it moves, and I find very nicely that it has a period very similar to my heartbeat. It is a 1 second pendulum. Now, this length is a precise number in order to accommodate the period of 1 second, and that happens to be 9.77144 inches in length. It is the pendulum. Now, we will not argue the variance during the day, during the month, during the year. It is substantially that a 1 second pendulum is pretty close to 9.77144 inches in length. That number now falls to us as an instrument itself. We now have a number, which is not quite existential, but it is part of the great pattern of approach with which we are to, through the lens of time, produce notions and ideas that can be cataloged as units of time. Now, these units of time can then be ascribed to a number, and we find that we can expand the number, we can subtract the number, we can apply it to other things, and an offering now to show the wide latitude of the usages of time and units of measure is by us determined as a length, the longest length on this object, which we call the Philosopher's Stone. The length of this object on its longest edge is 7.60722 centimeters, and that is precisely 3 inches. Now we have a reference here for taking a number as centimeters or inches, but that's not what we're interested in. We're interested in where can we find the number 7.60722 as an instrument of process in what we'll call the dynamic of the natural order. And it is such that the number 7.60722 as a number can be formulated as a period of time in seconds. When we then now find that since we have the instrument of timing by taking a length and finding out what its period, we can ask the question, if we did have a pendulum that had a period of 7.607 seconds, then how long would the pendulum be? And it turns out that the length of that pendulum would be 47.3 plus feet high. Now, for the entrance of our study into the classification of dynamics, this is one of the first numbers that we need to access the natural order and how nature works as frequency. Because for this height of 47.3 feet is the length that we will find is traversed by a falling object in a period of 2 seconds of time. The first second of time, the object will fall a little more than 15 feet. And the second of fall, it will fall a little more than 32 feet. The ratio between these two numbers is finally found in all textbooks as the ratio of the acceleration of gravity. It is a function that is given to us surely and directly if we but know how to use this length. The author of this stone, in many ways, has precipitated to us those avenues to discovery of things we already know and participate with. For it is certain knowledge to most any student of science in the world that the acceleration of gravity, as demonstrated by a falling object, is that the period of a pendulum, the height of the distance of fall, will be 7.60 plus seconds of time. So we have an operation between the vision and the practice of associating a period of time with an event which is time-like and can be associated with numbers. All the lengths that are on this object, 12 of them altogether, each one can be a signification for a period of time. To mention a few and attend to the list, that this length on this side is a number. Now, if we were to ask a Mayan astronomer to tell us what his great number is for his science, one of the numbers which he would surely give us is the period of the conjunction of the planet Venus with the Earth relative to its orbital position with the Sun. That is a period of 585 point something days. This line is 5.8524 centimeters. It is abstracted from what it is into the larger domain of a natural astronomical timing framework. Same thing with other lines here. Each line can be the instrument to detect some period of time, and we can find out what that goes to. We're not limited to the single decimal. We can multiply by 10, we can multiply by 100, we can divide by 10 or 100 to find the number. For it is surely in the number that there is the language of the event or practice or procedure or measure that will give us information that is already in the function of nature and which we want to understand. That brings us to the idea that if we thought perhaps that we could find a single object in the world that would be the ultimate object demonstrating, if we can use the phrase, ultimate wisdom obtained by the human intellect, by the human intuition, and by the human artist to form those notions and ideas in the simplest and most elegant form that is possible for us to connect ourselves with. It might be wondered that we would continue with such an outrageous pursuit of saying such a thing as, I hold in my hand a replica of the most wondrous object demonstrating human intelligence. The selection of proofs to any individual in that they would ask a question falls down to probably the most precious question that anyone really might ask me. And while it is, I would regard as precious, it's almost quite simply the most mundane. And it is, of what use is this object to me? If a person had the original Philosopher's Stone in their hand, how would they use it? Of what value would it be? What would it do to and for them? How is it that a person might even consider that they could meet the author of the stone at a level of wisdom to find who they were? Not only the author of the stone, but the person who is asking the question. The most fundamental question in all of philosophy and metaphysics is, who am I? Where am I going? What is this about? What is it for me? Why was I born? What is there for me to do? The question of the human individuality and finding the measure of itself in its performance. Mostly, the performance of the seeker is a good practice. An open-ended seeker, one who is willing to learn and gain new information, but also the determined act of being very alert to any unit of information which they are adopting. Descartes reminds us to be very careful about the units of our information. If we take information from another person merely because that person recommended it or found it or so on, we're to be very careful. Always we are we. Always. We are the one. Not being mindful of that, we will buy many of a comedic explanation of science and the natural order. Such almost monstrous allusions to the impossible offered as the keys to a reality. Our investigation, personally, as we have used the information we have gained from our study of the measurement of many monuments all over the world, many works of art, many places where there are works of art, there are many objects which I have been able to apply my measuring instrument to. The primary instrument being myself, of course, and the use of tools. And that is why the first tool for me is that it must be reconciled to time. There are correlations between the function of time into periods which are identifiable by number. An example is the distance from the tip of Khafre Pyramid to the tip of the head of the Sphinx is a number of feet. It is 2,366.172 feet between those 2 points. Multiplied by 100 becomes the very number for the measurement of the equator of the planet Saturn. To measure Saturn's rotation and to know the size of it as a sphere is to know about timing. And it is one of the fundamental notions of all timing that mostly all time and all units of timing do descend to us in some way or another from the timing of the planet Saturn. Whether it be a year or a day, period of the moon, whatever we are attempting to measure and assign some time value to, sooner or later we will wind up with a relationship that is sure with the timing of the planet Saturn. It turns out in my study that many of the objects can be assigned a number in an order of a canon of number. This is a series of numbers which are determined as harmoniously relative and in relationship to any other canon number. An example is that any measure on this Philosopher's Stone as a line can be related to any other line, and the measure will be found, and somewhere along the line you are going to end up with an association with the timing of the planet Saturn. Now, timing is not only a unit of measure like a year or a determined duration like a day or period like the lunar month. Timing is also structured in growth in the form of the spiral. If we examine the vine as it spirals up the tree or the fence posts, we'll see that the order of the progression of the leaves follows a very simple and ordered sequence of approximation of the golden number. That is the number 1.618. In other words, if we take a circle and divide it by that number, we're going to find a progression of the leaves or branches somewhere near that number. There will be a triadic relationship as the growth ascends up the stalk. And the timing then for a notion of the planet Saturn is such that if we can arrive at a number, and if it is a canon number, then it can be associated with any other canon number. I find that the format of a work of art, an obelisk, or some statue, or a sculpture formed in jade, that the format is initiated from some kind of association with the planet Saturn. And Saturn is, after all, finally, how can we say, the nucleus of all timing. In our solar system, all relevant frequencies eventually will be associated with the order and timing of Saturn. It is our notion that we gain from the study of the Philosopher's Stone and from the application of the values that we find to go into the pyramid and find the lengths and breadths of passages and angles and rooms, that the information is surely given and the language is simple. And it is that the ordered motion in a universal context of the motion of the earth in an expanding space, and a ratio of that expanding space, which is the very number that we find for the 1 second pendulum, the inverse being 0.102339046, which is the ratio of the acceleration of gravity. That the earth is moving in such a fashion and in a direction, a vector, toward the star Regulus at such a very high rate of velocity as to be 1/6 the velocity of what we regard as the limiting case of light, of which we will have more to say. These numbers that we put before you are numbers which are assigned the merit of true measure. And for a measure to be true, it must be accessible from other elements of the natural order. In other words, to say that the number for the measure of a mile in the Canon system is 5,258.16 feet. That's the number of feet in a Canon mile, measurable on the equator or anywhere. And that this number, when multiplied by 100, is the very number for the minutes of time in a Canon year. We have the measure of a year as a number and the measure of a mile, and they are both instruments of reflection to themselves, the difference being only the decimal point, which is moved over 2 units. Other illustrations of the synchronistic aspect of time and timing are that on the Giza Plateau, the pyramid of Mycerinus is at a substantial height of 226 feet. If we now find the period of a pendulum that is expressed at that height, it is 16.6666 seconds. It is an ordered Canon number. But also, this is to say that in one Canon day, that pendulum will beat 5,258.16 times in one Canon day. So the enjoining of a single number in different categories, incidentally, this is what is called for by Descartes, to say that a single number must be such that it can cross categories and different disciplines in science and still be held as itself, but relevant in different disciplines. He calls for this. The number for the period of timing of the year in minutes and seconds, the timing for the orbit of the moon, the period of a planet in an orbit, the succession of the ratios between planets in orbit, such as the ratio between, let's say, Mercury and Saturn. How many times does Mercury orbit the Sun in our notion of a Canon cycle during the period of one orbit of Saturn? It's a number. All those numbers that are available to us for the first 6 planets in order are stored for us in the geometry and architecture of the 20 stones in the floor of the king's chamber. These numbers are surely only the numbers that form in the spaces provided, and these numbers are the abstractions of the periods of the planets as derived from one signal unit of time, and that is the complete rotation of the galaxy in 226 million years. How many times all the planets, at least those first 6 planets, will complete orbits is listed in the measurement of those stones. And this is an example and a demonstration of the Canon feature that a number can be relatable to time and timing. The aspect of functioning time, as I demonstrate with a 9.77 inch pendulum, 1 second of time, and then the rotation of the Earth's equator during that period of time, a perfect number of Canon feet, 1,500 feet. And there will be 87,636 periods of that pendulum during one Canon day. The order of number and the feature of the progress of the operation of number is such that in the domain of the Canon, all these numbers are perfect. The problem is that the observer watching any one of the natural functions as a pendulum or a falling weight or whatever will always find variance. And this is the complement to the natural order. It is to affirm and assure that whoever comes to this stone and is able to figure out all the values is greater in individuality than what he's holding in his hand. Individuality is the sure demonstration of the universal order. The provision for this on the stone was that this little corner on the rear of the stone was broken when I removed it from the hole. The corner and the number that's associated with this corner are such as to show that though you may have everything perfect, you cannot do it all. This always finally how things really do work. It is the guarantee of the succession of individual expressions by a tree, a leaf, a bird, a fish, an elephant, its performance as it is in the natural order, expressing how it fits in it all.